If you ever feel out of control around food, you're not alone, and you're in the right place to learn practical, no-nonsense information about why you binge and how to stop. Binge eating does not mean that something is wrong with you. It's a natural but primitive brain response that you can correct. If you're ready for change, sign up for the Brain Over Binge self-paced online course for less than $20 per month. And if you feel you need personalized support, we also offer one-on-one coaching and group coaching. To learn more, go to brainoverbinge.com/subscribe. And I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the Brain Over Binge podcast, where you learn a simple, brain-based approach to ending binge eating. I'm Kathryn Hansen, your host. It's great to be back recording another show. If you're new to this podcast, know that this show is no longer on any sort of set schedule. I'm just releasing episodes as I can. So make sure to subscribe to the podcast so that you know when new episodes are released. I also include any new episodes in my monthly newsletters that I send out through email, so you can stay updated by subscribing to that newsletter as well. There's a link in the show notes to get on the list for my monthly newsletter, or you can sign up on brainoverbinge.com. When you sign up for the newsletter, you'll also get my free ebook, The Brain Over Binge Basics, which is in PDF format, and it's a guide to just help you understand your urges to binge and also to help you start breaking the binge eating habit. I hope you'll find the ebook and the monthly newsletter to be valuable resources in your recovery. I also include blog posts and other resources in my newsletter, and I keep you informed about any upcoming courses or any discounts that I'm offering. I'm going to move on to today's topic, which is going to be a little different from other shows. I'm going to share something about my own experience when I was in therapy for binging. If you're a regular listener, or if you've read either of my books, you know that my approach offers an alternative to typical therapy for binging. Therapy was not effective for me, and my ideas depart from the mainstream philosophy that drives most therapy, which is that binge eating is a coping mechanism. I've talked extensively in my books and on my blog and in other episodes of the podcast about why I think it can be very harmful to think that you have to solve your life's problems or learn to cope well with all of your emotions in order to stop binging. When I was in therapy, I was told that I used binge eating to fill some sort of emotional void or as a way to numb myself or escape from my problems. And I think this only served to solidify the habit instead of helping me let go of it. Now, this is not to say that sometimes another problem or an emotional issue may need to be dealt with in order to ready yourself for recovery. I've addressed this topic in 2 other episodes so far. The first was episode 15, which was titled Readiness for Recovery from Binge Eating. And the second was episode 45, which was an interview with Maria Marklove titled Trauma, Depression, and Binge Eating Recovery. The links to those episodes are in the show notes if you want to listen to discussions that are related to what I'm talking about today. Sometimes there are complicating physical or mental health issues that affect your ability to dismiss the urges to binge, such as any psychiatric disorder that compromises the functioning of your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that helps you overcome the impulse to binge that comes from the more primitive brain centers. Something that I want to give a special mention of here, which I don't think I specifically talked about in either of those other 2 episodes, is the issue of severe trauma or PTSD, or any problem where the person is dissociating and therefore unable to connect in some moments to their higher brain and their rational decision-making abilities. This is definitely something that would need to be addressed in order to make recovery possible. Personally, I was not dissociating when I binged, and the vast majority of people I've worked with and spoken to are also not dissociating when they binge, although there is certainly that feeling of being out of control during the binge, which is a feeling that can be understood in a new way and overcome. I understand and acknowledge that the issue of what might need to be dealt with before someone is able to tackle recovery can be nuanced, regardless of what approach to recovery is used. But the main message I'm trying to convey here is just to make sure that you're getting the professional help you need if there are complicating factors. However, another message that I want to get across, which I'm going to be telling a personal story about in this episode, is that I think it's harmful to many people who seek therapy for eating disorders when it's automatically assumed that there is some problem or some emotional issue that must be dealt with prior to recovery. I think it's harmful when it's automatically assumed that there must be complicating factors, even if there are not any that are evident. I think it's harmful when it's automatically assumed that there must be something traumatic in the person's past that has to be uncovered and resolved, even if that person does not believe there's anything out of the ordinary. I think it's harmful when binge eaters are told that normal life problems and normal emotions, which can certainly be very difficult at times, are complicating factors, and that those normal life's problems and normal emotions need to be addressed and overcome in order for the binge eating to stop. When the mainstream theory that binge eating is a coping mechanism is applied across the board to everyone, then the first order of therapy becomes about finding what the person must be trying to cope with. This does a disservice to so many people who simply started binge eating after a period of dieting, or after overeating habits simply increased over time and developed into binging. Instead of getting right to learning to break the habit and learning to eat enough and take control back from the primitive drive to binge eaters are instead told to look for where they are broken. It's not empowering to be told that there must be something emotionally or psychologically wrong with you that you need to find and fix before you can stop a habit. So this is where my therapy story comes in. One therapist I had in college was helping me try to find some problems in my past that could have possibly explained my binging. I remember telling her that my childhood was overall pretty normal, but with all good intentions on her part, we explored a lot of ways that the way I was raised could have possibly been problematic. We explored some potential theories of how my childhood could have maybe harmed me. And something we eventually came up with and settled on and discussed for many sessions, instead of learning how to fix my binge eating habit, was this. We decided that my parents told me that everything was fine too much. We decided that there were times that I actually did not believe that things were fine, but my parents implied that my concerns and my emotions were not valid. And we decided that me not being validated enough as a child eventually led me to develop unhealthy ways of coping with my emotions, and the coping mechanism that I was using, my therapist said, was binge eating. So this is a pretty brief version of the story. I'm not going to bore you with too many details about my childhood, but let's just say for a minute that this theory that my therapist and I came up with about my feelings not being validated enough was true. Still, this did nothing for me as far as helping me stop binge eating. I binged just as much after I uncovered this in therapy, and I binged just as much after I worked through a lot of my feelings with my therapist. I thought I was unlocking some sort of clue that would make my urges to binge start to go away, but it did not. My binges had started years before as a survival reaction to dieting, and the binges continued due to habit, and my urges to binge kept coming no matter how well I learned to deal with my emotions or how well I understood and came to terms with problems from my past. As I've reflected back on this over the years, I've realized that not only was this therapeutic approach unhelpful for recovery, I don't even think that this particular theory that my therapist and I came up with about my childhood was true, at least not in a way that made my experience much different than other kids. This problem that we uncovered was one of those standard life problems that by connecting it to my binging, it only served to make my binge eating more meaningful to me and made me cling to it even more and made me believe it served a purpose for me. I started thinking about this therapy experience this summer because with my kids constantly around, it's easy to notice how much kids' emotions fluctuate and frankly, how much they tend to complain about things. I want to preface this by saying that kids are amazing, and I know that all of you parents and caregivers out there will agree with me that kids are wonderful, and each child has so many incredible and unique qualities, and you love your children so much that it overshadows the more frustrating parts of their nature. But I'm going to be real here for a minute that kids can have a lot of gripes and a lot of mood swings. This is just one tiny example, but my daughter told me a few days ago that it was, quote, the worst day of her life because she had to drive with me to run some errands. But by the end of the trip, we were having a great time together. Another example is that kids will often fight with each other and say they hate each other one minute, and then the next minute they're happily playing together. They often get overtired, and my kids will get so upset with me for putting them to bed early, but then they wake up cheerful in the morning like nothing ever happened. We're all like this to an extent as far as our emotions fluctuating, but I feel like it's much more evident in kids. Their emotions are more fluid, they don't get stuck in one feeling for long, especially when they're very young. And because as parents and caregivers we see this, we see that their emotions fluctuate, it's easier to be dismissive sometimes, because you realize that their emotion is simply going to run its course. When a child gets worked up about something, you realize that a lot of the time the child doesn't actually mean what he or she is saying in that moment. And once the strong emotions pass, that child will return to their normal self. Of course, I do try my best not to be dismissive when I think there is an actual problem that needs to be addressed. Although I'm certainly not perfect in determining what's an actual problem that needs my attention and what's their normal emotional ups and downs that are going to self-correct. Some things are really clear, like when they're overtired and they're complaining about going to bed and also complaining about everything else in their life. It's very evident that they simply need to get some sleep, and they'll see things more clearly when they wake up. This is so much more effective than trying to talk to them in those moments that they're so tired and trying to validate all of their emotions right then and having a discussion about how to solve everything that they're complaining about. Is it possible that my kids feel dismissed in those moments and like they're not being acknowledged when I tell them to go to bed instead of entertaining all their complaints? Probably. But I'm actually okay with that because I think it's the best thing. But is it possible that they're going to talk about this one day in therapy and tell me how wrong I was for it? That's definitely possible. They might think I'm being dismissive when I'm not particularly sympathetic to their feelings when they're complaining about having to do chores or having to brush their teeth or needing to run some errands with me. Certain things in life just need to be done whether you like it or not, and I want them to learn that complaining about it doesn't help matters. There are so many times during the day that kids bicker with each other and then they'll tell their caregiver something wrong that their sibling is doing or that their friend is doing. And if the caregiver spends time addressing every single one of those complaints, it might render the caregiver ineffective in accomplishing much else during the day. It's like if an elementary school teacher were to stop a lesson every time a student had something they were unhappy about, the students in the class would not learn very much. I think about this and I think about the nature of children that I'm seeing every day, and which has been especially evident this summer for some reason. And then I think about sitting in therapy when I was 20 years old and looking back at my childhood and being very disappointed that my feelings may not have been given enough attention. And all of this digging into my pretty normal past was so that I could somehow try to solve a sort of mystery that was my binge eating. It was a waste of time at best. I'm definitely not saying that everyone out there listening should just be okay with all of the ways that you felt dismissed as a child. There are, of course, certain things that parents should not dismiss, and parents and caregivers should absolutely help children to learn to deal with their emotions. But, like I said earlier, expecting parents and caregivers to give undivided attention every time a child has a negative emotion or voices a negative thought is unrealistic. If you're a parent, you know how much else there is to do that comes with raising children and maintaining a household and a career and finances and maintaining relationships and interests outside of your household. It's a lot, and some days it can feel very overwhelming. And in the moments when your kid is crying because maybe she wants to use the green crayon right now, but her sister's using it and won't give it back, or because her brother put one toe in her room when she told him not to come in her room, or because your kid got the sprinkle cookie when they really wanted the chocolate chip one, it can really feel exasperating. There's no way a parent is going to validate all those feelings, and a child does not need to be validated in every moment in order to not develop harmful habits. What I've realized after having a house full of my own kids is that when my parents told me things like, "You're fine," or "Don't worry about it," or "Stop complaining," or even, "That's ridiculous, Kathryn," probably 9 times out of 10, it was due to what I've been talking about here, the sheer fact of how difficult parenting is and how kids do have a tendency to complain about a lot. Were there times that I might have had a legitimate need for them to help me through some sort of emotion and they didn't? I'm sure that was the case sometimes. But were there also times that I may have been better off trying to work through an issue on my own, but my parents jumped in to try to rescue me from my emotions and problems? Absolutely. And I'm sure this is the case to an extent for every child. And now I have all the compassion in the world for the fact that my parents were just doing the best they could as imperfect people. And I hope that my kids grant me that same compassion one day. This is something I did not see when I was sitting in therapy at 20 years old. With the help of my therapist, I thought my parents were wrong. I thought it was partially their fault, and in some moments I thought that it was all their fault that I ended up with a binge eating habit. Without kids of my own at that time and without experiencing the immense pressure that can come along with that, it was easy to point out the flaws of my parents and use that as a reason that I was doing what I was doing with food. It was easy to think of all the ways that I could have been raised better, that may have prevented me from going down the path of binging. But the thing is, even if I somehow would have received the perfect amount of validation from my parents, and even if I would have learned to cope with all of my childhood emotions in whatever way could be thought of as ideal, I believe that my dieting behavior still would have led me to binging. Binge eating was a survival response to food restriction, and then it took hold in my brain as a habit. It was not a way I was coping with not being validated well enough as a child. Even without a therapist encouraging me to find the flaws of my parents, I was at the age where teens and young adults typically believe their parents to be wrong about a lot of things anyway. If you're a young adult going through this right now, I do not want to discount any of your negative feelings about your past family life, because I know your feelings are valid in many ways. And certainly if there's any sort of abuse or mistreatment in your background, I'm definitely not telling you to ignore it and simply to excuse your parents for their actions. There are things that may have happened to you as a child that you would benefit from talking to a professional about and working on healing yourself emotionally from those experiences. Although I do not believe that this is a cure for an eating disorder, it can be part of your journey toward building a better life for yourself and putting yourself in a better mind state to work on your recovery. Like I talked about in the beginning of this show, there can be some nuance in what may need to be addressed before someone is ready to recover. I did not have any major trauma in my past, so I realize it's much easier for me to say that dealing with issues from my childhood was a waste of time. But I also think that always assuming there's something in the past to be dealt with, and therefore helping people find problems in their childhood and suggesting that it's the parents' fault, is not an efficient or an effective way to treat eating disorders. There were other issues in my life and in my personality that I also blamed my binge eating on as well, which I may talk about in future episodes. But this particular one had been on my mind during this busy summer, as I find myself being an imperfect parent, trying to deal with a lot of things and still give my kids the attention and the validation that they deserve. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you benefited from the story I shared. No matter what has happened to you in your childhood or in your past, you have the power to change your brain and live a binge-free life. The Brain Over Binge podcast is produced and recorded by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC. All work is copyrighted by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC, and all rights are reserved. As a disclaimer, the host of the Brain Over Binge podcast are not professional counselors or licensed healthcare providers, and this podcast is not a substitute for medical advice or any form of professional therapy. Eating disorders can have serious health consequences, and you are strongly advised to seek medical attention for matters relating to your health. Please get help when you need it, and good luck on your journey. Need more help? You can find all of our current and upcoming options for support at brainoverbinge.com.